Hi, welcome to the channel. My name is David, and this is Fresh Faces, New Ideas. If you like what I do and you like the channel, please support me by liking and subscribing, or follow me on Twitter at Faces Ideas. You can also hear my thoughts on the Center Left Radio podcast when I do that weekly, and there will be other opportunities to hear me in the future. So, this episode is going to be about the filibuster. I'm going to very briefly discuss what it is, how you break it, and then some ways to change the filibuster because it's no longer being used as intended, or the mythology around it that it has grown into, the way it's mythologized, is no longer being used that way. So what is the filibuster? The filibuster was originally designed in order to allow the Senate to debate bills. So, for example, H.R. 1 is the John Lewis for the People Act. So if they were going to debate this bill, they would need a 60 vote threshold currently to allow it to come to a vote. So when you hear so if they never got that 60 vote threshold, that bill would be considered dead on arrival. Now you hear this term a lot because as long as there's no filibuster reform, as long as you don't have a 60 vote threshold, you just can't get legislation through. So the only way that legislation goes through is when it has a majority vote, and this comes with there's certain caveats which you do. Generally, that only comes into reconciliation bills, which have their own sort of rules about when you can use those. They're generally budgetary matters. They're generally omnibus spending bills that are passed at the end of the year, raising the debt ceiling, and just funding the government. Those tend to be the bills that end up being passed because those require the country to function. Although, to be fair, the funding the government bill, we've had more government shutdowns in the last couple of years than we've had basically in the history of the country. And part of that is grandstanding under Donald Trump. In 2018, I believe it was, he shut the government down for like a month and a half for his border wall, and then didn't get that. So there are caveats to those certain bills even passing. So how do you break a filibuster? Well, there's two ways. You need unanimous consent. So the majority will call unanimous consent. Let's say they're talking about H.R. 1, and they've been talking about it for a week or so. They'll say, all right, I want to bring unanimous consent to bring this vote to the floor. So that means that all 100 senators have to be there, and all 100 senators have to vote yes. We can bring this bill to the floor for a vote. In which case, it would just need to pass by a majority. However, let's say one senator says, no, I don't want to do this. What then is required is called cloture. What happens with cloture is you need 16 senators from the majority to sign saying we want to invoke cloture. Then, according to Senate rules, they can't even do it then. So let's say it's a Monday. I call for unanimous consent. One senator says no, so I invoke cloture. I have my 16 signatures, and we now have to wait for 2 days. So if I call for cloture on Monday, I have to wait till Wednesday to bring it up. And in order to do that, for the cloture vote, I need 60 votes in order to break the filibuster and bring a bill to the floor. Now, originally, what the filibuster was designed for, as I mentioned before, is for debate, is in order to discuss bills and stuff. However, that's not what it's been used for. In the past, especially under Barack Obama, it was used just to kill every single piece of legislation that he wanted to pass. So he couldn't get his agenda across because once the Republicans had control of the Senate, they just said, no, you're not getting any of these bills, even when they brought them to the floor. So now there are a lot of what's been discussed, especially during the primary and since Joe Biden has come into office, is how do we change the filibuster in order to do it. Now, there's a whole number of ways, but the two caveats to this are Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin have both said we will not abolish the filibuster. Now, abolishing the filibuster is considered the nuclear option. I'm going to get to that first, but there are some ways in order to make the filibuster a little bit more efficient and allow certain bills to no longer fall on this. So that is, the first way is to change which votes fall under the filibuster. So the filibuster doesn't cover everything. It got changed to not cover nominees because nominees were basically just getting stalled. And in order to fill the government with the people who needed to be filled with it, they had to change the filibuster rules so a simple majority would cover them. It also doesn't cover reconciliation bills. Reconciliation bills are generally under the Byrd rule, and they're generally budgetary restrictions. It's usually funding bills and things like that. If it considers something that's going to affect the economy, it's how the Republicans pass their tax cuts, and it's ultimately how the Biden administration is going to pass their COVID bill. So one of the ways to weaken the power of the filibuster without outright getting rid of it is to change what actually falls under a filibuster. So this only requires a 51 vote threshold, and you can say that certain legislation is that falls under certain categories. So a couple examples for this, for legislation that would not need to have the 60 vote or couldn't be filibusterable. All you would need is a vote threshold. Could be currently it's reconciliations, but it could be bills doing with voter rights, the debt ceiling, healthcare, or funding bills, or things like that. So statehood bills. So part of the reason for this, especially for statehood bills falling under this similar category to confirmations, is the point of the filibuster is to allow debate and to allow amendments to certain bills. So if you, for certain things that it doesn't matter what amendments you put into it, it's not going to change. Like, for example, confirmations. Like, I can introduce an amendment that says the budget director can't do this, but the budget director is in charge. They're not going to change who they are and what their belief on the policies are. So there's no point in having an amendment process for that. And it's similar to statehood bills. So a state, if you're arguing about, what should become a state, for example, D.C. or Puerto Rico, the argument is basically yes or no, D.C. should be a state, and what are the boundaries. You're not going to put an amendment that says, okay, D.C. doesn't get any senators. Like that's not going to happen. There's certain things you're not going to be able to do because that's not what that type of legislation entitles. So for putting statehood bills away from the filibuster and have them under their own section means that you would only need to have a majority to push for statehood, which would be good, because as far as Republicans are concerned, they said we will not allow an actual vote on DC statehood. And then you could have this debate and then say, okay, well, because we've changed the rules, we can push for DC statehood, or we can push for Puerto Rico statehood, or you can push for statehood. That's one of the examples of something that you could remove from the filibuster, because the filibuster process doesn't make sense for that. Another way is voting rights. Like I said, H.R. 1 is coming up, and a big part of H.R. 1 is pushing for the expansion of voting rights, whether it is curbing the use of voter ID laws, or it is expanding voter registration, or expanding vote by mail. It expands votes. It expands the rights that allow Americans to vote more and be a further part of their democracy. So putting this type of bill under there would allow you wouldn't have to deal with these arguments where they're just lying about what's in the bill. I mean, you're still going to have to deal with those arguments always, because they're going to be used as an attack ad. But because you segment it and you say, this has to do with voting rights. And then ultimately, for anything that's segmented like this, you would have something similar to the parliamentarian. I'm going to do a video on the parliamentarian later. But you'd have some side of parliamentarian for each of these segments as you broke them off, who says, okay, this falls under whatever the bird rule type formation for, if it's a voting rights bill, if it's a reconciliation bill, if it's a debt ceiling bill, if it is a statehood bill. I mean, statehood bills are pretty obvious. It's, should D.C. be a state? Should Puerto Rico be a state? Things like that, like blatantly obvious. But, if you're arguing something like H.R. 1 for a voting rights bill, you would have someone similar to a parliamentarian. Now, the thing with the parliamentarian is, currently as it stands, the parliamentarian is not the overall decider. You can remove the parliamentarian, and you can also overrule them. So there are caveats to that. But having, if you push it as this way, say, look, there are things that need to be pushed better. Because of the timing we're on, there's currently 160 to 200 voter restriction bills currently being passed in about 30 states. We need to create a faster process in order to expand voting rights for people so their rights aren't trampled on, especially with the weakening of the Voters' Rights Act anyway. So this type of position where you could put the Voters' Rights Act in its own separate non-filibuster category would allow you to pass more things that would allow to strengthen the democracy of this country, and then you can move on with that. Same thing with healthcare. Instead of having to pass, some 60-vote threshold where you would need to give people health care. Because if you think about it, the last major bill that passed through bipartisanship, or not even bipartisanship, through the filibuster, was Obamacare. And we know how that worked out. It wasn't great, but we do have a healthcare problem. So you could bring up, Joe Biden's public option. You could argue about Medicare for all, or some of these type of arguments. And like I said, you could simply have a parliamentarian whose job is to decide, okay, does this bill fall under this category? This would allow separate debates on actual bills, but it would allow them to push forward with legislation that's generally needed. One of the biggest concerns of Americans has been healthcare. This would allow you to push for and be able to actually put in some type of healthcare plan. Same thing with funding bills and the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling is always, they're always threatening to not raise the debt ceiling, and then they raise it anyway. But, make sure the debt ceiling and the funding bills, in order to keep the government going, so it's not a fight every time, allows you to focus on other things. The advantage of doing a lot of these things is it increases the likelihood that government works. Part of the problem is that things like the filibuster are used to break government. If your argument is government doesn't work, and then you have a tool like the filibuster in which you can actually stop government from working, you're just proving your point, but not because you're proving your point by just making a statement. You're breaking something and saying, look, this thing is broken, although I broke it, but I'm not going to take any credit for that. So this would allow the government to actually function. It would allow important pieces of legislation to pass through. And the big thing with this is, by doing it this way, segmenting certain things that would affect large swaths of the country and large swaths of the populace, would allow for smaller bills to get through and larger bills to get through. But it would also allow the super big bills, to things that don't fall under that, to have their own debate, the separate debate. So if you wanted to do, so this would separate things. So there's the House has currently passed two bills, while the Senate is debating debating the COVID bill. So they passed the HR 1, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and the George Floyd Act, which is a policing act. So under this system, the Voting Rights Act would be its own separate thing, which would only require 50 votes. The George Floyd bill would require 60 votes. And this way you can actually you can pass massive bills and handle multiple crises. You can handle multiple large segments of helping Americans at the same time, because it's easier to push through different agendas. This way you don't have to worry about Congress just passing one bill and then, we wasted all our ammo on this one bill, and now we got to wait and now it's the next year and we're going right into the elections. By separating these types of bills, you would be able to pass more legislation. This would give Congress a better chance, and this would give Congress people a better chance to go back to the people that they represent us, go back to the American people, and they can say, look, here's what we've done for you. Or they can say, because right now a lot of the argument that people use is either government doesn't work, or look how I'm stopping these things from happening. So you can say, look, I'm actually pushing for these things. And you can say, I've passed this thing that's made your life noticeably better, and here's how we did it. This also keeps the 60-vote threshold, which some of these senators want. They want to have, they want to keep this idea that there's going to be bipartisanship, and they want to, that the Senate is somewhere for debate. So by segmenting off smaller parts, you're allowing the people who want to have actual legislation passed quickly to deal with crises or to deal with pressing issues of the country, but you also allow people who want the 60-vote threshold and this myth of the Senate, being a body of debate to continue. So the other way is you can change what actually takes to break a filibuster. So one of the options would be a talking filibuster. So a lot of the myth around this is from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where you have that one senator just talking for hours and hours and hours, and he's the one who sways the hearts and minds of his colleagues, and that's how things get changed. Currently, we don't have a talking filibuster, so you can just say that you're going to filibuster a bill or you're not going to vote to override the cloture in order to push it. But there's two things with this. One, there are absolutely senators who will talk for hours and hours and hours and hours, and some of it will be garbage. Most recently we have Ted Cruz reading Green Eggs and Ham. You have Ron Johnson is currently filibustering the COVID bill. He was talking about how big a $1 trillion were, like physically big it was, or how much a single person would have to work to create $1 trillion. So they would make things up. But the thing is, if you're doing certain bills and you have to force them to to filibuster it, you're going to get sound bites. And that's part of the thing. If your argument is that this is the place for the debate, the Senate is where debate should happen, well, then you should have these actual debates. You shouldn't just say, I'm not going to vote for it, and I'm not going to change my mind, so it doesn't matter what you say to me. Either way, you should have to defend your position. So you should say, okay, well, here's why I don't believe that the HR 1 should pass. Here's what I think it's bad that more people have access to voting rights. I think taxpayer money shouldn't be used to fund elections or whatever your argument is. But you should have to actually defend it. And by having people, have a talking filibuster, you have to cover this certain amount of time. So put your money where your mouth is, and then just back up your actual positions. This way, the American people can see not whatever sound bites they're getting fed when you go on a Fox News or a CNN or an MSNBC or a Newsmax or whoever interview. We have your actual words. So if you say, if you're talking about minimum wage and 5 hours in, you say, look, the poor don't need any more money. They don't deserve to have a living wage. That's in the record. Now the American people know what you really think about it, and that's a good point of this. Ideally, the final option would be the nuclear option. It's called the nuclear option for everything. So there has already been a nuclear option for federal appointees and for judges. So, for example, the 3 Supreme Court nominees that Donald Trump put on the Supreme Court only needed a 51 vote threshold, and this is because originally the Democrats removed the threshold for judicial nominees because they were getting blocked, but they left it for Supreme Court nominees. But because the Republicans didn't have a 60-vote threshold, they just got rid of that. So you only needed a 51-vote threshold. So now a 51-vote threshold nuclear option for the filibuster would basically get rid of the filibuster. This is probably the least likely option for any of these things to happen because Joe Manchin has made it very, very clear he will not do this. Kristen Sinema has made it very clear that she will not do this. So this option, while it's really nice and fun to talk about and ultimately might be the way that it is required to go, won't likely happen. The other problem with a bill like this is, or a fix like this is, you're not always going to be in power. As we've seen during the Donald Trump administration, they started with the White House, the House, and the Senate. And then 4 years later, they didn't have any of them. So if they had abolished the filibuster, whatever they had been able to pass during their tenure, when they lost control of things, they would no longer have any control in the minority in order to stop bills that the majority pushes. So that's really the big pushback to a bill like that is, you're not always going to be in power. And yes, that's true, but my belief is if you actually abolish the filibuster and you pass the things that have 65, 75, 90% approval rating, well, then it doesn't matter. They're going to keep you in power because you're doing things to help them. The other thing is this is a more a similar to fix to that is you change how the debate works. So if a bill is going to be debated, you say, okay, so for the first 2 days, it takes 60 votes of cloture. And then for the next 2 days, it takes 55 votes of cloture. And then for the next 2 days, it takes 54 votes. And then ultimately, like a week later, you say, okay, it's 51 votes now because we've been discussing this enough. At this point, we're going to discuss this. We've discussed this long enough, and we're either going to pass it on a majority or we're not going to end up passing it ever. So that's how you do it. This way, it still allows people to have their debates. It still allows them to push their amendments, and it still allows them to have the things that the Senate is supposed to do, but it allows it to function because you can't hold up a certain bill endlessly. For example, Mitch McConnell said that he was going to just never bring up bills so they would die, so it was irrelevant whatever's passed. But if we were going to filibuster a bill forever, HR 1 could be on the table from now until 2024, whenever, even if Joe Biden controls the Senate and the House next time, but if they don't have a 60-vote threshold, HR 1 could still never pass because they will never have the filibuster-proof majority. So by having a limit to how long you can actually filibuster for, you force people to make their argument, and then if they're not changing their minds eventually, the majority will say, look, we still have the mandate of the people because we are the majority, so therefore we will continue to push with our legislation. But this also allows people to say, okay, well, here's my argument. Because look, if the Senate, as their argument goes, is as, debatable and is, the fine gentlemen of the Senate, they're the ones who are calm and cool-headed, and they can have, good arguments and make good points and change their minds, then they could, in theory, do that. We all know that's never going to happen. There won't really be a change. But this will allow the Senate to continue doing the business that it wants to do, but also actually being able to pass stuff. The other thing is, part of the problem with cloture is you need to have 60 votes present. So under Barack Obama, they had the 60 votes, but unfortunately one of the senators, Ted Kennedy, had brain cancer. So he wasn't actually in D.C., and he wasn't able to cast a vote. So they couldn't break the filibuster because he was dying. So one of the ways to change that is to flip it. Because the minority are the ones who are stalling this vote, they have to be the ones to keep 41 people at all times near the Senate in order to keep the filibuster going. So because this changes the pressure, because the whole thing is the filibuster is designed to protect the minority. That's literally what their argument is. But it's not the actual people's minority, it's the minority of senators. So if your argument is we're not going to allow you to expand certain voting rights or to expand certain legislation, you should be forced to be the ones who delay every single vote, to have the 41 votes. It should not be on the majority to convince you. You are the minority. It is your job to convince the majority that they are wrong, because you do not have the mandate of the people by being the minority. So to quickly wrap this up, there's a couple ways to allow for the filibuster to change and to allow our government to work the way it should be. Change the rules on cloture so that instead of having to wait 2 days, it's a day or it's immediate after, so things can go faster. Change what falls under a filibuster, create little segments, whether it's for voting rights, whether it's for state rights, whether it's for the funding bill, whether it's for the debt ceiling, things that would, similar to reconciliation, exist for simply, a majority vote. That this way you can pass bills and then that are important and will affect a lot of people, but would also allow you to have your debates for other places. You can change just simply how the filibuster works, whether it's a talking filibuster so that you actually have to stand. I have to stand and explain for 5 hours why I believe this bill is bad, or I believe this bill is bad because I'm filibustering it. I'm not allowing it to continue. Or you do the nuclear option. You basically get rid of the filibuster and have it. If I have the majority, it's whatever. As long as I have the majority votes, that's it. Or you can change the way the debate goes, so that you say after a certain amount of time, as time goes on debating a topic, the required votes in order to break the filibuster gets smaller, so that the filibuster can't indefinitely hold up every single piece of legislation. It allows for Congress to have their debates, it allows for the Senate to have their debates, and then it allows them to move on to something else because they have, had their arguments. And then, what was the last piece? The final piece was to have the 41 votes as the people opposed to breaking the filibuster. They have to be the ones who are present in the Senate, because it's they who are deciding that the majority's legislation can no longer go forward. They have to keep the 41 senators there in order to say, we're continuing to argue that our point is valid, even though we are currently in the minority. So if you like this video and you support the things that I do, and you want to know more about future videos, please like and subscribe. Please follow me at Faces Ideas on Twitter. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.